Welcome to Sugar and the Money video. In this video, we are going to tell you about what is GSTR-4, what are the eligibility to file GSTR-4, what are the formats in which you will file GSTR-4, and what are the rules relating to GSTR-4. So, let's take an overview about GSTR-4. So, GSTR-4 is a quarterly return that a taxpayer opting for a composition scheme needs to furnish. So, a composition dealer who is opting for a composition scheme needs to file GSTR-4, which is a quarterly return, and a dealer who are registered under the composition scheme is required to furnish GSTR-4 by 18th of the month succeeding the quarter period. Now, what is GSTR-4? GSTR-4 is a GST return which is to be filed by a composition dealer under the composition scheme. As a normal taxpayer who needs to furnish 3 monthly returns, a dealer opting for the composition scheme is required to furnish only one return, which is GSTR-4. Now, we will see who will file GSTR-4. So, a taxpayer under the composition scheme or a taxpayer who will opt for the composition scheme is required to file GSTR-4. Now the question arises that what is composition scheme? So it is a convenient way for a small taxpayer to escape from too many GST responsibilities. So as a normal taxpayer you have to file 3 monthly returns, but as a composition dealer who are covered under the composition scheme, they have to file only one return, that is GSTR-4. And the turnover limit for the taxpayer who are registered under the composition scheme has been now increased to 1 crore, which was 75 lakhs. So now the turnover limit is 1 crore. So any person whose turnover is below 1 crore can opt for the composition scheme. Under this scheme, a taxpayer will pay a tax as a percentage of his turnover during the financial year, but he cannot take the benefit of input tax credit. So note that a composition dealer who is covered under the composition scheme is not allowed to take benefit of input tax credit, and the floor rate of tax for CGST and SGST shall not be less than 1%, and the taxpayer, a composition dealer who is opting for a composition scheme, will not collect any tax from his or her customer. So he will issue a bill of supply instead of a tax invoice. As a normal taxpayer, you have to issue a tax invoice, but when you are covered under the composition scheme, you have to issue a bill of supply. And when the eligible taxpayer who is opting for the composition scheme under GST, a taxpayer has to file a summarized return on a quarterly basis instead of 3 monthly returns. So you need not to have upload invoice wise details, so you just need to file a summarized return which is on a quarterly basis. Now, are you a registered dealer under composition scheme? If yes, for the person who are already registered under the GST regime wants to convert to the composition scheme. So any person being granted registration on a provisional basis, that if he is registered under VAT, service tax or central excise law, and who wants to opt for composition scheme shall file an intimation in form GST-CMP-01, which will be duly signed before or within 30 days of appointment date. And if the intimation is filed after the appointment date, the registered person will not collect any of the taxes and will issue a bill of supply for all the supplies. What will contain in form GSTR-CMP-03? So it must be filed within 60 days of the exercise of option. And what are the details will appear over here is details of stock, inward supply of goods received from unregistered person held by him on the date preceding the day of exercise of option. Now, the person who wants to apply for a fresh registration, he is not covered in any GST scheme. So, for fresh registration under this scheme, they have to file an intimation in form GST registration 01 should be filed. Register under GST and a person switches to composition scheme. Every registered person in GST and opts to pay tax under the composition scheme must follow the following steps: that he has to file an intimation in form GST-CMP-02 for exercise option, and in statement form GST-ITC-3 they have to give details of ITC relating to any inputs lying in the stock, inputs containing semi-finished or finished goods within 60 days of commencement of the relevant financial year. So now we will see, while filing GSTR-4, what are the fields required. So there are 7 types of purchases in GSTR-4 and 1 type of sale. So what are the purchases? So the first one is B2B. So B2B is a type of purchase from business to business. B2B UR, which is business to business unregistered dealer, like if business done with any unregistered dealer. Now the third one is CDNR. So credit note or debit note registered. CDNUR, credit note, debit note unregistered. Number 5th is import of services, if services are availed from outside the country. 80, that is advance tax, advance amount paid on reverse charge supply. Now the 7th purchase is 80ADJ, that is advance tax received adjusted, any advance amount on which tax was paid earlier but invoice received in this period. So these are the 7 types of purchases you have to fill accordingly in GSTR-4. Now comes is a sale. So in sale there is only 1 type of sale, which is tax on outward supply. So any tax which you have paid in outward supply you have to mention in GSTR-4. Now what are the composition scheme rules under GST compliance? So in composition scheme there are different form which have to be filed for respective purposes. What are the form? The form that is form GST-CMP-01. What is the purpose of this form? This form is to opt for scheme for provision registration holder. For this, the due date is prior to a appointment date or within 30 days of said date. Now the next form comes up is form GST-CMP-02, intimation of willingness to opt for scheme. So if you want to opt for composition scheme by your willingness, you have to fill this form prior to commencement of financial year. Next form is GST-CMP-03. In this, you have to give details of stock and inward supply from an unregistered person. For this, the due date is within 90 days of exercise of option. Now the next form is GST registration 01. That is for the purpose, if you want to register under the composition scheme, you have to fill prior to appointment date. The next one is form GST ITC 01. In this, you have to mention the details of the stock, input stocks, semi-finished and finished goods, which have to be filed by 30 days of option withdrawn. Now we will see what are the condition and restriction for composition scheme. Number 1. A casual taxable person and a non-resident taxable person cannot opt for the composition scheme. Number 2. He must be a trader or manufacturer or a restaurant business who are serving without alcohol. Number 3. That the person who is taking the composition scheme must not be a service provider. Number 4. He must be covered under the turnover limit, that is less than 1 crore. So the person who is opting for the composition scheme is covered below the turnover limit, that is less than 1 crore. Now we will see what are the tax rate under the composition scheme. As we have seen, in a normal taxpayer, you have a different rate of taxes. So in composition scheme there is a different rate of taxes. For a trader and manufacturer, they have to pay 1% of tax that has been segregated to CGST and SGST, that is 0.5% of CGST and 0.5% of SGST. In total, 1% of tax has to be paid by the traders and manufacturers. For a restaurant businesses who are serving without alcohol will have to pay 5% of tax, that is 2.5% of CGST and 2.5% of SGST. In total, they have to pay 5% of the taxes who are under the restaurant businesses. Note that service provided are not eligible for the composition scheme. Now we will see what are the due dates of GSTR-4. So as we know, GSTR-4 has to be filed by the end of the quarter period. The due date of filing GSTR-4 is 18th of the month after the end of the quarter period. Let's take an example that the due date of GSTR-4 for the quarter of July to September 2017 is 18th October 2017. But the due date of GSTR-4 has been extended till 24th December 2017. So it can be further be extended as per the government notification. Now we will see what if GSTR-4 is not filed. What if we will not file GSTR-4? What are the penalties we have to pay for non-filing of GSTR-4? So a penalty of rupees 200 per day is levied if GSTR-4 is not filed. So we have to pay 200 per day if we have not filed GSTR-4, and the maximum penalty that can be charged is rupees 5,000. And if GSTR-4 is not filed for a given quarter, then the taxpayer cannot file the next quarter return either. So we have seen that what are the penalties and what if GSTR-4 is not filed. Now we will see that is it possible to revise GSTR-4? No, GSTR-4 cannot be revised after filing on the portal. For any reason you have done any mistake in the return, it can be revised in the next quarter return only. For an example, if you have made mistake in GSTR-4 for the month of July to September quarter, you can rectify the same when you will file the next quarter GSTR-4. Now we will see what are the details required for GSTR-4. So the first requirement is GSTN. A taxpayer GSTN will be auto-populated at the time of filing return. The next field is name of the taxable person. The taxpayer name will be auto-populated when you will log in yourself to the GST portal. The third point is aggregate turnover. In this section, the taxpayer has to furnish details of the previous year's gross turnover, aggregate turnover, and the aggregate turnover for the period of April to June 2017. For the first GST-4 return, you have to enter manually. After this period, when you will come to the next return, that is October to December, it will be auto-populated. Now comes up the inward supply, including supplies on which tax is to be paid on reverse charges. So what are the details to be provided in this field? So in this field, all purchases from registered person, both attracting reverse charge and other than reverse charge, unregistered person and import made are to be mentioned over here. Purchases from registered dealer will get auto-populated based on GSTR-1 filed by the seller. For first two quarter, it will not be auto-populated from GSTR-1. Now comes up the next field is amendment to details of inward supplies furnished in the return for earlier tax period in table 4, including debit note, credit note and their subsequent amendments. So what are the details you are required to fill up over here is any change in the details of inward supply furnished are to be made here, such as change in invoice amount, if you want to change your invoice amount, if you want to change your tax amount or etc. And debit note or credit note issued by the taxpayer, and also you can make amendment in the debit note or credit note furnished in earlier period are to be mentioned over here. So the next field comes up is tax on outward supply made. So in this field you have to mention all the sales made by the composition dealer have to be mentioned over here. Now comes up is amendment to outward supply details furnished in return for earlier tax period. So in this field you have to mention any change you want to make. For the details of sales provided in previous return is required to be stated over here along with the original details. Now comes up is the consolidated statement of advance paid or any advance adjusted on account of receipt of supply. So in this field you have to mention the advance amount paid for reverse charge supply, and you have to also mention the advance amount on which tax was paid in earlier period, but the invoices has been received in the current period. So it is called advance adjusted on account of receipt of supply, where the tax amount to be reduced from the liability. So the tax amount will be reduced from the liability are to be mentioned over here. Also, you can make the amendment in advance relating to the previous period have to be mentioned over here. Now the next field is TDS credit received. So in this field you have to mention any TDS deducted by the supplier while making payment to a dealer registered under the composition scheme is to be mentioned along with the GST of the deductor, gross value and the tax amount. The next field is tax payable and paid. So any TDS amount payable and paid mentioning separately, that is IGST, CGST or SGST and cess. So the next comes up is interest, late fee and payable, late fee payable and paid. So in this field you have to mention the interest and late fee payable and paid for late filing and payment of tax is to be mentioned over here. Now the next field comes up is debit refund claim from electronic cash ledger. Any refund of excess of taxes paid can be claimed here. The refund has to be further segregated into tax, interest, penalty, fees and others. And the last option is debit entries in cash ledger for tax or interest payment. In this field you have to mention tax paid in cash, interest and late fee. Once all these details are filled, in the sign off you have to sign off with a declaration that the all information has been supplied is correct. Then you can further file your GSTR-4. So in next video we will tell you how to file GSTR-4. So thank you for watching our videos and have a nice day.